Citizens, society, and the state. Russian citizens are affected by many contradictory influences from their political culture. When questioned, most say that they support the idea of a democratic government for Russia, although many do not believe that one exists today. However, they also like the idea of a strong state and powerful political leaders, characteristics that help to explain the popularity of Vladimir Putin as a political leader. Cleavages. The Russian Federation has many societal cleavages that greatly impact policymaking, including nationality, social class, and rural-urban divisions. Nationality. The most important single cleavage of the Russian Federation is nationality. Although about 80% of all citizens are Russians, the country includes sizable numbers of Tatars, Ukrainians, Armenians, Chuvashes, Bashkirs, Belarusians, and Moldovians. These cleavages determine the organization of the country into a federation with autonomous regions, republics, and provinces whose borders are based on ethnicity. Like the breakaway republics of 1991, many would like to have their independence, although most have trade benefits from the Russian government that induce them to stay within the federation. A notable exception is Chechnya, a primarily Muslim region that has fought for years for its freedom. The Russian government has had considerable difficulty keeping Chechnya as part of Russia, and the independence movement there is still very strong. In recent years, Chechens have been involved in terrorist acts, including the 2004 seizure of a school in southern Russia that resulted in gunfire and explosions that killed more than 350 people, many of them children. Almost certainly, other regions within Russia's borders are watching, and the government knows that if Chechnya is successful, other independence movements will break out in the country. In an effort to gain legitimacy for the Russian government in Chechnya, a referendum was held to vote on a new constitution for the region. The constitution was approved by the Chechen voters, even though it declared that their region was an inseparable part of Russia. With Putin's support, former rebel Ramzan Kadyrov became president of Chechnya in 2007, but the fighting has not stopped, with killings and kidnappings remaining quite common. Kadyrov has ruled Chechnya virtually as a separate Islamic state, with his own 20,000-strong army, his own tax system, and his own religious laws. Some have criticized Putin for allowing Kadyrov such free reign, especially since many are suspicious that Kadyrov's men have been involved in murders, kidnappings, torture, and extortion. The entire area of the Caucasus is currently restive, and Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 increased tensions all across the region. In the summer of 2009, a suicide bomber tried to kill the president of Ingushetia, a republic that borders Chechnya, with a Chechen group involved in the Beslan school siege taking responsibility for the attack. Explosions and bombings increased all across the Caucasus later that summer, and suicide attacks returned after a few years of relative calm. Russian nationalists have taken responsibility for kidnappings, beheadings, and a 2006 bombing that killed 10 at a Moscow market operated mostly by immigrants. At least 37 people were killed and more than 300 injured in his xenophobic attacks in 2010, according to the Sova Center, a Moscow-based organization that tracks such violence. One of the most widely publicized cases came in December 2010, in the wake of a fatal shooting of an ethnic Russian soccer fan by a man from Russia's North Caucasus region. Thousands of young people began an extended riot close to Red Square, chanting, "Russia for Russians," and racial slurs. In 2014, Russia hosts the Winter Olympics in the Black Sea resort of Sochi, almost on the doorstep of insurgent unrest in the Caucasus. Security always had been tight in Sochi, where Mr. Putin has a presidential residence that he uses often, and where he frequently hosts visiting foreign leaders. The government further tightened security before the Games, which officially began February 7, 2014. The Games proceeded without serious incident. Religion. Tsarist Russia was overwhelmingly Russian Orthodox, with the Tsar serving as spiritual head of the church. In reaction, the Soviet Union prohibited religious practices of all kinds, so that most citizens lost their religious affiliation during the 20th century. Boris Yeltsin encouraged the Russian Orthodox Church to reestablish itself, partly as a signal of its break with communism, but also as a reflection of old Russian nationalism. Today, most ethnic Russians identify themselves as Russian Orthodox, but they are still largely non-religious, with only a small percentage regularly attending church services. The growing acceptance of the church was demonstrated in 2007, when the Russian Church abroad reunited with the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian Church abroad had split off after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, vowing never to return as long as the godless regime was in power. In a meeting in 2003 in New York, Putin met with leaders of the church to assure them that this godless regime is no longer there. You are sitting with a believing president. After the reunion in 2007, Moscow still retained ultimate authority in appointments and other church matters, and many critics say that the church is too much under government control. Other religions are represented in small percentages: Roman Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and Protestants. Since the current regime is relatively new and political parties have few ideological ties, no clear patterns have emerged that indicate political attitudes of religious versus non-religious citizens. However, in the past, Russia has generally followed a pragmatic combination of authoritarianism and flexibility toward minorities. One pattern worth noting is a rapid rise in the Muslim share of the population in recent years. Russia has more Muslims than any other European state except Turkey, and some estimates show as many as 20 million Muslims in the country. Muslims are concentrated in 3 areas. 1. Moscow. Muslims form a large share of laborers who have migrated to Moscow in recent years to find work. 2. The Caucasus. In this area between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, many ethnicities, including Chechens, are Muslim. This area is often seen as a hotspot of trouble, along with Palestine, Kashmir, and Bosnia for Muslims. The repression of Chechens, as well as intermittent violence in the entire region, was the biggest issue for Putin as he tried to cultivate Russia's role in global Muslim affairs. The region remains highly volatile today. 3. Bashkortostan and Tatarstan. Muslim relations with Russians are generally calmer in these 2 regions than in the Caucasus. Tatarstan's Muslim president, Mintamir Shamiev, accompanied Mr. Putin around the Middle East in 2005 as the president tried to restructure Russia's image as a country supportive of Islam. In 2013, the government conducted several crackdowns on radical Islamists, largely in preparation for the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi. In June 2013, the police arrested 300 Muslims in Moscow, 170 of whom were foreigners. The Muslims were found with extremist literature, Radio Free Europe reported, and were considered to be a threat. Putin said at a meeting of security force officers that the country must continue with the systematic arrests in order to fight against corruption, crime, and insurgency. Social class. The Soviet attempts to destroy social class differences in Russia were at least partially successful. The old noble peasant distinction in Tsarist Russia was abolished, but was replaced by another cleavage: members of the Communist Party and non-members. Only about 7% of the citizenry were party members, but all political leaders were recruited from this group. Economic favors were granted to party members as well, particularly those of the Central Committee and the Politburo. However, egalitarian views were promoted, and the nomenclatura process of recruiting leaders from lower levels of the party was generally blind to economic and social background. Today, Russian citizens appear to be more egalitarian in their political and social views than people of established democracies. Many observers of modern Russia note that a new socioeconomic class is developing within the context of the budding market economy. Entrepreneurs that have recently amassed fortunes from new business opportunities, although the fortunes of many of these newly rich Russians were wiped away by the 1997 business bust. Many survived, and new ones have emerged since then. Boris Yeltsin's government contributed to this class by distributing huge favors to them, and a small but powerful group of entrepreneurs sponsored the presidential campaign of Vladimir Putin in 2000. In the Putin era, oligarchs have come under fire for various alleged and real illegal activities, particularly the underpayment of taxes on the businesses they acquired. Vladimir Gusinsky, Media Most, and Boris Berezovsky were both effectively exiled, and the most prominent, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Yukos Oil, was arrested in October 2003 and sentenced to 8 years in prison, with his company trying to protect itself from being dismantled. In 2011, his prison term was extended, but Putin pardoned him in late 2013. Rural-urban cleavages. Industrialization since the era of Joseph Stalin has led to an increasingly urban population, with about 73% of all Russians now living in cities, primarily in the western part of the country. The economic divide between rural and urban people is wide, although recent economic woes have beset almost all Russians no matter where they live. City dwellers are more likely to be well-educated and in touch with Western culture, but the political consequences of these differences are unclear in the unsettled current political climate. Beliefs and attitudes. In the old days of the Soviet Union, citizens' beliefs and attitudes toward their government were molded by Communist Party doctrines. At the heart of these doctrines was Marxism, which predicted the demise of the capitalist West. This belief fed Russian nationalism and supported the notion that the Russian government and way of life would eventually prevail. The ideals of the revolutionary era of the early 20th century envisioned a world transformed by egalitarianism and the elimination of poverty and oppression. As Stalinism set in, the ideal shifted to pragmatic internal development, and many of the old tendencies toward absolutism and repression returned. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought out much hostility toward the government that is reflected in the attitudes of Russian citizens today. Mistrust of the government. Political opinion polls are very recent innovations in Russian politics, so information about citizens' attitudes and beliefs toward their government is scarce. However, the limited evidence does reflect a great deal of alienation from the political system. Most polls show that people support democratic ideals, including free elections and widespread individual civil liberties and rights. However, most do not trust government officials or institutions to convert these ideals to reality. Alienation is also indicated by a low level of participation in interest groups, including trade unions and other groups that people belonged to in the days of the Soviet Union. An interesting bit of contradictory evidence, though, is the high level of approval that Vladimir Putin enjoyed during his first 2 terms. Even though his approval ratings have vacillated since 2008, they remain high, and other Russian public officials have not shared his relatively high level of popularity. Statism. Despite high levels of mistrust in government, Russian citizens still expect the state to take an active role in their lives. For most of Russian history, citizens have functioned more as subjects than as participants, and the central government of the Soviet Union was strong enough to touch and control many aspects of citizens' lives. Today, Russians expect a great deal from their government, even if they have been disappointed in the progress of reform in recent years. Economic beliefs. Boris Yeltsin's market reform created diversions in public opinion regarding market reform. Nearly all parties and electoral groups support the market transition, but those with more favorable opinions of the old Soviet regime are less enthusiastic. At the other end of the spectrum are those that support rapid market reform, including privatization and limited government regulation. The latter approach was favored by Yeltsin, and his shock therapy marketization was blamed by his critics for the steep economic decline that characterized the 1990s. Westernization. Political opinion followed the old divide of Slavophile versus Westernizer. Some political parties emphasize nationalism in the defense of Russian interests and Slavic culture. These parties also tend to favor a strong military and protection from foreign economic influence. On the other hand, reform parties strongly support the integration of Russia into the world economy and global trade. Economic beliefs and attitudes toward the West also shape attitudes about whether or not the modern regime should integrate elements of the old Soviet government into its policymaking. Some citizens are nostalgic about the good old days when everyone had a guaranteed income, and they are most likely to support the Communist Party that still exists within the party system. Some observers see a generational split between those who remember better times under the Soviet power and those who have come of age during the early days of the Russian Federation. Political participation. Russian citizens did actually vote during Soviet rule in the 20th century. In fact, their voting rate was close to 100% because they faced serious consequences if they stayed home. However, until Gorbachev brought about reforms in the late 1980s, the elections were not competitive, and citizens voted for candidates that were hand-picked by the communist leadership. Gorbachev created competitive elections in the Soviet Union, but because no alternative political parties existed yet, voter choice was limited to the designated party candidate versus anyone from within party ranks who wanted to challenge the official candidate. In some cases, this choice made a real difference, because Boris Yeltsin himself was elected as an alternative candidate for president of the then Russian Republic. Protests. After the economic crisis of the late 2008, a series of protests were organized around Russia to criticize the government's economic policies, as the economy sank to its lowest point since 1997. The largest was in Vladivostok, in the far eastern part of the country, where about 1,000 protesters marched through the streets in late January 2009. The Russian Communist Party organized a rally in Moscow and called for a return to the centralized economic policies of the Soviet Union. The authorities approved the rally, and riot police officers watched the march but did not interfere. Other demonstrations against the government, as well as some in support, were held in several cities throughout the country, with none apparently turning violent. Putin's decision to run for the presidency in 2012 sparked some of the largest protests in recent years. Protests broke out after the parliamentary elections in December 2011, with accusation that the United Russia had rigged the elections. Then, on the eve of the elections in May, about 20,000 people protested in Moscow, according to a Reuters news report. Many were angry that Putin was extending his 12-year domination of Russia with another presidential term, as the crowd chanted, "Russia without Putin," and "Putin, thief." Opposition leaders were arrested as violence broke out in several cities, including in Vladivostok, the Ural city of Kurgan, and Kemerovo in the western Siberia. Putin ignored the protests, and since then, no major protests have been allowed. Russia's involvement in the Ukrainian crisis caused much controversy, with many Russians supporting the government but others openly criticizing it. In early 2014, Boris Nemtsov, a leader of Russia's liberal opposition, was shot dead on a bridge by the walls of the Kremlin. A few days earlier, Mr. Nemtsov had been handing out leaflets for an anti-war rally to protest Russia's support of rebels in eastern Ukraine. The march turned into a memorial procession. 6 days before Mr. Nemtsov's death, the Kremlin organized protest marches bearing slogans denouncing Ukraine, the West, and Russian liberals. Alexei Navalny, another opposition leader, described the emergence of pro-government extremists and terrorist groups who openly fight the opposition. Voter turnout. Since 1991, voter turnout in Russian Federation has been fairly high, higher than in the United States, but somewhat lower than turnout rates in Britain and France. Political alienation is reflected in the 50.3% rate in the 1993 Duma elections, but those elections followed a failed attempt by the Duma to take over the country. Voter turnout in the Duma elections in December 2003 was just under 56%. For the election in December 2007, the turnout was almost 64%. And for the 2011 election, the turnout was just over 60%. Meanwhile, voter turnout for the presidential elections declined between 1991 and 2004, with almost 75% of eligible citizens voting in the first round election in 1991, and less than 65% voting in 2004. The turnout in the presidential election of 2008 was almost 70%, but the turnout for 2012 fell to just over 65%. Civil society. Despite the relatively high voter turnouts, participation in other forms of political activities is low. Part of this lack of participation is due to a relatively undeveloped civil society, private organizations and associations outside of politics. For example, most Russians don't attend church on a regular basis, nor do they belong to sports or recreational clubs, literary or other cultural groups, charitable organizations, or labor unions. Only about 1% report belonging to a political party. On the other hand, Russians are not necessarily disengaged from politics. Many report that they regularly read newspapers, watch news on television, and discuss politics with family and friends. Civil society appears to be growing in Russia, although since Putin's re-election in 2012, the government appears to be imposing new restrictions. Before the 1917 revolution, little civil society existed because of low economic development, authoritarianism, and feudalism. Soviet authorities argued that only the party could and should represent the people's interests, and so state-sponsored organizations appeared in a state corporatist arrangement, with the government clearly in control of channeling the voice of the people. The Russian Orthodox Church was brought tightly under the control of the Communist Party. With the advent of glasnost in the 1980s, however, civil society slowly began to emerge, and since that time many organizations have formed to express points of view on different issues, including the environment, ethnicity, gender, human rights, and healthcare. Despite the proliferation of these groups, the government has placed severe restrictions on their activities, especially on groups that are openly critical of the government's policies. Rather than directly attacking the groups, the government has used a number of tactics to weaken them, such as investigating sources of income, making registration with the authorities difficult, and police harassment. Since Putin's re-election in 2012, non-profit groups have come under particular pressure with new laws that severely restrict foreign financing and require them to register as foreign agents. In addition, the definition of high treason has been expanded to include assisting foreign organizations. Russian youth groups. As president, Vladimir Putin created a handful of youth movements to support the government. The largest is Nashi, and others are the Youth Guard and locals. All are part of an effort to build a following of loyal, patriotic young people, and to diffuse any youthful resistance that could have emerged during the sensitive presidential election of 2008. Nashi organized mass marches in support of Mr. Putin and staged demonstrations over foreign policy issues that resulted in the physical harassment of the British and Estonian ambassadors. For example, after Estonia relocated a Soviet-era war memorial in April 2007, Nashi laid siege to the Estonian embassy in Moscow, throwing rocks, disrupting traffic, and tearing down the Estonian flag. Members of the group attacked the Estonian ambassador, and her guards had to use pepper spray to defend her. In May 2011, some 50,000 members of Nashi gathered for a rally against corruption in downtown Moscow, where they concentrated on the corruption of government opponents, not on government officials. When anti-Putin protests broke out in late 2011, Nashi countered with allies and support rallies in support of Putin and the United Russia. Nashi's opponents deride the organization as a modern version of Komsomol, the youth wing of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Nashi receives grants from the government and large state-run businesses, so critics of the group see it as an arm of an increasingly authoritarian state.